When Timoteo Ferrel arrived in Ashbridge, Mississippi, he had nothing but a canvas sack of clothes and a rusted hammer wrapped in cloth. No name anyone recognized, no family, no past worth telling. But 5 years later, every acre of land, every mill, every building worth owning bore the name Ferrel. The fortune came too fast, too clean, and then came the tragedies. Generation after generation, the Ferrel family grew richer and smaller. 100 years of unexplained deaths, vanished servants, and whispers behind locked doors. Coincidence? Or was the price of their legacy signed in blood? Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe, and let us know in the comments. Would you accept a cursed inheritance if it guaranteed your fortune? Now back to the story. When Timoteo Ferrel arrived in Ashbridge, Mississippi, he had nothing but a canvas sack of clothes and a rusted hammer wrapped in cloth. No name anyone recognized, no family, no past worth telling. But 5 years later, every acre of land, every mill, every building worth owning bore the name Ferrel. The fortune came too fast, too clean, and then came the tragedies. Generation after generation, the Ferrel family grew richer and smaller. 100 years of unexplained deaths, vanished servants, and whispers behind locked doors. Coincidence? Or was the price of their legacy signed in blood? Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe, and let us know in the comments. Would you accept a cursed inheritance if it guaranteed your fortune? Now back to the story. It was the bitter winter of 1813 when Timoteo Ferrel first appeared in Ashbridge. The town, barely more than a collection of wooden structures clustered around a sawmill and church, was hardly the kind of place that attracted newcomers, especially not during the harshest months of the year. Local records from the Ashbridge Historical Society described the winter of 1813 as uncommonly severe, with temperatures so low that the Mississippi River partially froze over for the first time in living memory. According to the Journal of Reverend Samuel Hadley, the town's Presbyterian minister at the time, Ferrel arrived on foot during a snowstorm so fierce that even the mail coach had been delayed for 3 days. "A strange man appeared at the church door," wrote Hadley, "soaked to the bone yet showing no signs of cold. His eyes were dark and unblinking, his accent foreign but difficult to place. When asked from where he had traveled, he simply replied, 'Far enough to know this is where I must stay.' The Reverend offered him shelter in the church basement. The same offer extended to any traveler in such weather, but Ferrel declined. Instead, he walked directly to the abandoned Miller cottage at the edge of town, a place most locals avoided after the entire Miller family had died of fever the previous spring. No one had bothered to claim the property, as it was said to be cursed after 3 generations of Millers had met untimely ends within its walls. Surviving accounts describe how Ferrel began working immediately, despite the weather. He repaired the cottage roof in the middle of the blizzard, working through the night. Townspeople claimed they could hear the steady rhythm of his hammer until dawn, though many questioned how any man could see to work in such darkness, much less endure the cold. "That first night set the tone," explains Professor Eleanor Blackwood, author of Supernatural Mississippi, A History of the Unexplained. The locals already found it unsettling. A stranger who appeared from nowhere during a historic storm, showing no fear of a house believed to be cursed, working through conditions that would have killed most men. From the beginning, there was something different about Timoteo Ferrel. Within days, Ferrel had established himself as a stonemason and carpenter of exceptional skill. His first paid commission was to repair the crumbling foundation of the Ashbridge Bank, a job completed in a single night, though other masons had estimated it would take a week. The bank's ledger, preserved in the county archives, shows a payment of $12 to Timoteo Ferrel on January 17, 1813. It would be the smallest sum ever associated with his name. Ferrel's rise from itinerant worker to wealthy landowner happened with disquieting speed. By spring, he had purchased the lumber mill after its owner, Jonathan Blackwell, died in what the town doctor called a peculiar accident, involving a saw blade that had inexplicably detached from its moorings. By summer, he owned the general store, the blacksmith shop, and had broken ground on what would become the grandest home in the county. a mansion of stone and dark that would later be known simply as Ferrel House. What makes Ferrel's ascension truly remarkable, notes historian Dr. William Hayes, is not just its speed but its timing. The economy was struggling after the War of 1812. Banks were failing. Businesses were closing. Yet somehow, Ferrel was amassing wealth when everyone else was losing it. The source of his fortune remained unclear. The official story, the one Ferrel himself told, was that he had discovered a new method of treating lumber that prevented rot, making his products highly sought after in New Orleans and beyond. But this explanation never satisfied the townspeople, particularly when no one ever observed any special technique being employed at his mill. Court records from September 1813 document the first of many unusual incidents surrounding the Ferrel properties. 3 workers at the lumber mill reported seeing unnatural shadows moving among the stacked timber, shadows that moved against the light rather than with it. All 3 men quit their positions the following day. When questioned by the sheriff, they refused to elaborate, each one claiming they had family matters elsewhere that required their immediate departure from Ashbridge. By the winter of 1814, exactly 1 year after his arrival, Timoteo Ferrel had transformed from penniless stranger to the wealthiest man in the county. He had also taken a wife, Elizabeth Thornton, the daughter of the former mayor. Their courtship was brief, their marriage rushed. Town gossip, recorded faithfully in the diary of shopkeeper's wife Martha Holloway, suggested that Elizabeth had been bewitched by the stranger. Miss Thornton, once the picture of bright youth and social grace, grew pale and withdrawn after her engagement to Mr. Ferrel, wrote Holloway. At their wedding, she spoke her vows in a voice so hollow and distant that her own mother wept not from joy but from some deeper dread. The wedding was held at Ferrel House, which had been completed with impossible speed. Architectural historians have since noted that the construction of such an elaborate mansion would typically require years, not months. More disturbing were the rumors that despite employing dozens of workers, no one in town could recall seeing more than 3 or 4 laborers at the site at any given time. The house itself seemed to rise from the earth like something grown rather than built, reads one account from the time. Its stones fit together so perfectly that not even a razor blade could slide between them. It was at this wedding celebration that the first truly inexplicable event occurred. As recorded in multiple sources, including Reverend Hadley's journal and several witness statements given to the sheriff years later, the incident happened just as midnight approached. Ferrel had disappeared briefly from the gathering, excusing himself to attend to business matters in his private study. Elizabeth, acting as hostess, continued to greet guests until the large grandfather clock in the hall began to strike 12. Witnesses reported that on the final stroke, every candle and lamp in the mansion simultaneously extinguished. In the moment of complete darkness that followed, multiple guests claimed to hear whispering voices speaking in a language none could identify. When the lights were relit moments later, Timoteo Ferrel had returned to the hall, though no one saw him enter, with a strange smile and a glass of deep red wine that several guests swore had not been served at the reception. More disturbing was the discovery made by a young serving girl who had ventured into the forbidden west wing of the house while searching for additional linens. She claimed to have opened a door and found an empty room where the floor was covered in a perfect circle of what appeared to be freshly drawn symbols, still glistening wet in the candlelight. When she returned with another servant to show what she had found, the room was empty and spotless. The girl, identified in records only as Mary, disappeared 3 days later. Her family received a letter claiming she had taken a position in a household in New Orleans, along with a year's wages in advance. No one ever heard from her again. By the end of 1814, Timoteo and Elizabeth Ferrel announced they were expecting their first child. The news should have been cause for celebration, but the town's midwife, Sarah Jenkins, noted in her records that Elizabeth appeared sickly beyond the normal afflictions of pregnancy, and that the mother-to-be confided that she dreamed each night of a shadow standing at the foot of her bed, counting on its fingers. On June 21, 1815, the summer solstice, Elizabeth gave birth to twins, a boy named Elias and a girl named Evangeline. The delivery was difficult, and for several hours, it was feared that Elizabeth would not survive. According to the midwife's account, the crisis passed only after Timoteo entered the birthing room alone, and emerged 15 minutes later, announcing that his wife would recover. Jenkins wrote, "I know not what transpired in that quarter hour, but when I returned to Mrs. Ferrel's side, her color had improved dramatically, and the bleeding had stopped entirely. Yet there was something in her eyes I had never before seen in a new mother. Not joy nor relief, but a haunted knowledge that aged her a decade in a day. Elizabeth never fully regained her health. She lived as a semi-invalid in the east wing of Ferrel House, rarely seen in public. When she did appear, townspeople noted her prematurely gray hair and the way she compulsively counted on her fingers when she thought no one was watching. As the twins grew, so did the Ferrel fortune and influence. By 1820, Timoteo owned nearly half the county. His business empire expanded to include shipping interests on the Mississippi, cotton plantations, and banking ventures as far away as New Orleans. With wealth came political power, though Ferrel himself never sought office. Instead, he placed his allies in positions of authority, men who owed their prosperity to his patronage and who never questioned his methods. It was during this period of expansion that the first of the family tragedies occurred, events that would become as much a part of the Ferrel legacy as their wealth. When we last left the story of the Ferrel family, Timoteo had established himself as the wealthiest man in Ashbridge County. His twins, Elias and Evangeline, were 5 years old, and his wife Elizabeth remained a reclusive figure within the walls of Ferrel House. What came next would establish a pattern that would haunt the family for generations to come. A pattern of prosperity always followed by tragedy. The first documented tragedy struck on a clear autumn day in 1821. Elias Ferrel, now 6 years old, had accompanied his father on what should have been a routine business trip to New Orleans. According to the ship's manifest of the steamboat Mississippi Belle, father and son boarded on October 12th, with return passage booked for October 19th. Only Timoteo would return. Newspaper accounts from the New Orleans Gazette detail what happened 3 days into their visit. The headline read simply, "Tragedy on the Levee. Prominent businessman's son lost to the river." The article described how young Elias had been walking with his father near the docks when he suddenly broke away and ran toward the water's edge. Before anyone could react, the boy had fallen into the churning waters of the Mississippi. Despite immediate rescue efforts by dockworkers and sailors, Elias Ferrel's body was never recovered. What the newspaper failed to mention, but what was recorded in a private letter from a New Orleans business associate to his wife, was the strange behavior of Timoteo Ferrel in the aftermath of his son's drowning. "I witnessed the most peculiar scene today," wrote merchant Thomas Wilkes to his wife. "Rather than displaying the devastation one would expect of a father who has just lost his child, Mr. Ferrel stood motionless at the water's edge, watching the river with an expression I can only describe as resignation. When I approached to offer my condolences, he turned to me and said, 'It always takes what it is owed.' I asked him what he meant, but he merely shook his head and walked away. When Timoteo returned to Ashbridge, he brought with him a sealed coffin, symbolic as the body had not been recovered, and arranged a funeral service at which Reverend Hadley presided. Witnesses noted that throughout the ceremony, Timoteo remained stoic, while Elizabeth appeared almost catatonic with grief. More disturbing were the accounts that Evangeline, Elias's twin sister, repeatedly told attendees that Elias isn't in there, he's still counting. Following the funeral, Timoteo threw himself into his business with renewed vigor. Records from the Ashbridge County Courthouse show that in the 6 months following his son's death, Ferrel acquired 3 additional plantations, expanded his shipping enterprise, and founded what would become the state's largest cotton processing facility. His fortune doubled, then tripled. The pattern was established, explains historian Margaret Watson. A Ferrel family tragedy, followed immediately by an inexplicable expansion of wealth. It's as if each death somehow fueled their prosperity. The second tragedy came in 1823, when Elizabeth's niece, Catherine Thornton, came to live at Ferrel House after the death of her parents. Catherine was 16, described in contemporary accounts as a beauty with a lively spirit, a stark contrast to the gloomy atmosphere that had settled over the Ferrel home since Elias's death. For a time, Catherine's presence seemed to bring light back into the household. Elizabeth emerged more frequently from her isolation, and even Evangeline, now 8 years old and described by her tutors as unnaturally serious, was seen playing in the gardens again. Catherine kept a diary during her time at Ferrel House, portions of which were preserved by the Ashbridge Historical Society. Her early entries speak of the grandeur of the mansion, the kindness of her aunt, and the odd but not unpleasant demeanor of her uncle Timoteo. But as weeks passed, her writings took a darker turn. "There is something wrong with this house," she wrote in April 1823. "Last night I awoke to the sound of voices beneath my floor, not from the room below, but as if coming from inside the very earth. They spoke in a language I do not know, yet somehow I understood they were counting. Counting what? I cannot say." A month later, "I found Evangeline in the West Wing today, in a room I had never seen before. She was drawing symbols on the floor with a piece of chalk, and when I asked what she was doing, she said she was preparing for the next one. When I asked what she meant, she looked at me with such cold eyes, not a child's eyes at all, and said, 'Someone always has to pay. Father says it's better when we choose who.'" Catherine's final entry, dated June 19, 1823, reads simply, "I cannot stay in this house another night. Whatever dwells here with the Ferrels is taking notice of me now. I feel its gaze. Tomorrow I will leave whatever Aunt Elizabeth says." Catherine Thornton never left Ferrel House alive. On the morning of June 20th, a maid found her body at the bottom of the grand staircase, her neck broken. The official ruling was accidental death, a tragic fall in the night, perhaps while attempting to flee as she had planned. Yet rumors persisted. The maid who discovered the body, before being dismissed from service and relocating to Tennessee, told several people that Catherine's face bore an expression of utter terror, and that clutched in her hand was a piece of paper covered in the same strange symbols that had been described in accounts of Timoteo and Elizabeth's wedding night years earlier. Most disturbing of all was the testimony of the town doctor, who arrived to examine the body. He reported that when he entered the foyer where Catherine lay, he found 9-year-old Evangeline sitting calmly on the bottom step, watching the scene with detached interest. When he asked the child to leave, she allegedly replied, "It's fine. I've seen it before. I'll see it again." Within a week of Catherine's death, Timoteo Ferrel announced a major expansion of his banking interests, opening new branches in 3 neighboring counties. The Ferrel fortune grew once more, and with it, the whispers. The pattern continued. In 1825, a distant Ferrel cousin who had come to apprentice in Timoteo's businesses was found hanged in his quarters. The death was ruled a suicide, though the note left behind consisted only of the repeated phrase, "It watches me count," written dozens of times in increasingly frantic script. With each death, the Ferrel wealth expanded. With each tragedy, Timoteo grew more powerful and more isolated from the community. By 1830, few in Ashbridge would meet his gaze when he walked through town, and none would accept dinner invitations to Ferrel House, regardless of the business opportunities such connections might bring. Elizabeth Ferrel's health continued to deteriorate. By the time Evangeline turned 15 in 1830, Elizabeth rarely left her bedchamber. Visitors described her as a ghost still breathing, her hair completely white, her once beautiful face lined with what appeared to be decades more age than her actual years. It was during this period that the first documented disappearances began, events that would become another hallmark of the Ferrel legacy. The first to vanish was a young stable hand named Thomas Green, hired in the spring of 1830. According to payroll records, Green worked at Ferrel House for exactly 29 days before disappearing without collecting his wages. When questioned by the sheriff, Timoteo produced a letter allegedly written by Green, claiming he had received word that his mother was ill and had departed urgently for Kentucky. The sheriff might have accepted this explanation had not 3 more servants disappeared under identical circumstances over the next 6 months, each working for exactly 29 days, each leaving without wages, each supposedly writing a letter explaining their sudden departure. None were ever seen again in Ashbridge or the surrounding counties. None had family members come looking for them, which struck many as odd, particularly in such a close-knit region. The most disturbing case was that of a 12-year-old orphan girl named Sarah, whom Elizabeth had supposedly taken in out of charity in the winter of 1831. Like the others, Sarah vanished after exactly 29 days in residence at Ferrel House. Unlike the others, a search was organized, not by Timoteo, but by Reverend Hadley, who had taken a particular interest in the child's welfare. The search parties found nothing, but one group reported a strange discovery in the woods behind Ferrel House. In a small clearing, they found what appeared to be a perfect circle of bare earth amid the forest floor, approximately 6 feet in diameter. Within the circle, not a single blade of grass, leaf, or insect could be found. Only bare, black soil that one searcher described as warm to the touch, though the day was bitter cold. At the center of the circle stood a single rose bush bearing black blooms, a botanical impossibility that was nevertheless attested to by over a dozen witnesses. When they returned the following day with the sheriff, the clearing, circle, and rose bush had vanished, with no sign they had ever existed. The year 1832 brought what appeared to be a respite from tragedy for the Ferrels. Evangeline, now 17, was being courted by James Preston, the son of a wealthy planter from a neighboring county. The match was considered advantageous, as the Preston family was one of the few in the region whose fortune approached that of the Ferrels. Elizabeth's health even seemed to improve slightly during this period. She was seen walking in the gardens of Ferrel House on occasion, always counting steps on her fingers, but nonetheless present in a way she hadn't been for years. Timoteo, now in his 50s, though his precise age remained a mystery, as no one knew his birth date, showed no signs of slowing. His hair had turned silver at the temples but remained thick and black otherwise. His face showed few lines, and those who did business with him remarked that he appeared to have aged little in the nearly 20 years since his arrival in Ashbridge. In October 1832, Evangeline and James were wed in a lavish ceremony at Ferrel House, the first social event hosted there in nearly a decade. The guest list included the most prominent families from 3 counties, many of whom attended out of political necessity rather than genuine desire to enter the infamous mansion. The wedding proceeded without incident until the reception, when James's younger sister, Emily, a girl of 14, wandered away from the celebration and into the forbidden West Wing. What she saw there was never fully articulated, as the girl fell into a state of catatonic shock from which she never recovered. She was found by a servant, standing frozen in the doorway of a room that, according to the house plans, should not have existed. Her eyes were open but unseeing, her mouth forming words without sound. She was returned to her family and lived another 40 years in an asylum in Virginia, never speaking again except on the anniversary of the wedding, when she would repeat a single phrase, "They're counting down. They're always counting down." The Preston family departed immediately, taking the catatonic Emily and the bewildered groom with them. James Preston never returned to claim his bride. Instead, he sent a letter formally annulling the marriage on grounds that had to be specially approved by a judge, grounds that were sealed in court records and have never been made public. Evangeline, rather than being devastated by this abandonment, seemed to accept it with the same eerie calm she had shown at previous family tragedies. According to Martha Holloway's diary, when she encountered Evangeline in town shortly after the failed wedding, the girl said only, "It's better this way. The counting room doesn't want him. It wants me." By year's end, the pattern had reasserted itself. The Ferrel shipping interests expanded dramatically after Timoteo secured an exclusive contract with a New Orleans export company, a contract that became available only after the company's previous owner and his entire family perished in a house fire that investigators deemed of suspicious origin. As 1833 dawned, the people of Ashbridge had come to accept a terrible truth. Wealth and death walked hand in hand with the Ferrel name, and neither showed any sign of releasing their grip on the family or the town that had become synonymous with their curse. But the true horror of the Ferrel legacy was only beginning to unfold. The worst was yet to come, in the form of a single night in 1835 that would forever cement the family's sinister reputation in American folklore. As the 1830s progressed, Ferrel House grew darker, not from age or decay, but from something that seemed to drink the very light from the air around it. Locals swore the shadows stretched further than they should, as if the mansion was consuming the space around it. Evangeline Ferrel, now her father's business partner, had transformed from a quiet child into something that made grown men avert their eyes. Her skin, so pale it was almost translucent, seemed to pulse with a rhythm just out of sync with a human heartbeat. "She doesn't blink," whispered Agnes Reynolds, one of the few servants who survived a month in that house. "Not when you'd expect. Only when something none of us can see moves in the corner of the room." Elizabeth Ferrel had become a ghost while still breathing. Locked in the East Wing, her once beautiful face now hollow. She spent her days by the window, skeletal fingers endlessly counting. The few who glimpsed her reported that sometimes her lips moved in perfect unison with movements in the shadows behind her. Shadows that shifted even when no one moved. The disappearances began in earnest now. First came the servants, 29 days of employment, then gone. Always 29. Never 28. Never 30. Letters would appear explaining their departure, the handwriting stiff and unnatural, as if guided by hands that had never held a pen. Then came the orphans. Between 1835 and 1840, 7 children from the county poorhouse entered Ferrel House. None were ever seen again. Each vanished precisely 29 days, 12 hours, and 7 minutes after crossing the threshold. "They need the innocence," Elizabeth whispered to her mirror, not knowing a maid stood frozen in terror behind her. "The counting room needs purity to balance what my husband brings it. But it's never satisfied. Never. Never. Jacob Tate should have been different." The sheriff's nephew, 10 years old with eyes that reminded old women of spring, was taken in by the Ferrels after his parents succumbed to cholera. For 29 days he was seen in town, clean, well-fed, quiet. Too quiet. "Miss Evangeline and her father spend a lot of time counting," he told his uncle when they met in the general store. "They count in the big room with no windows. The floor moves there, uncle. It breathes." On the 30th day, Sheriff Tate arrived unannounced. Jacob was gone, sent abroad, they claimed. The same story, the same letter, the same cold eyes watching as Tate read words that his nephew would never have written. The search revealed nothing, except a leather-bound ledger in Evangeline's study with names, dates, and amounts. Names of children, names of servants, names of people who had entered Ferrel House and never left. Beside each, a figure in dollars. Beside that, markings in no earthly script. Before Tate could seize it as evidence, Evangeline appeared. "The count is not complete," she said, her voice echoing as if speaking from inside a vast, empty chamber. "Return it." The deputy who found the ledger walked woodenly back to the desk and replaced it. His eyes, suddenly empty as a doll's, stared through Evangeline rather than at her. He walked out of the house, resigned his position the next day, and left town. Years later, when found in California, he claimed no memory of ever entering Ferrel House, though he still counted obsessively on his fingers when he thought no one was watching. The Ferrels grew more careful after Jacob. They brought in orphans from distant cities, servants with no connections, people no one would miss when they vanished on the 29th day. Business associates reported waking to find Evangeline standing at the foot of their beds, counting silently on her fingers while staring through them. Most fled. Some never got the chance. Maria Cortez, a seamstress, came closest to uncovering the truth. On her 28th day of employment, Evangeline led her deep into the forbidden West Wing, through corridors that grew colder with each step despite the summer heat outside. "The walls changed," Cortez later testified, her voice trembling. "From plaster to stone so ancient it felt like touching time itself. We reached a circular room with a dirt floor. In the center stood a table with an open ledger and a black rose that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. The floor was covered in symbols drawn in what looked like dried blood. The ledger contained names, dozens of them, with dates and figures. Evangeline said they needed just one more to complete the count," Cortez whispered. "She reached for me, but her fingers brushed against the silver crucifix hidden beneath my dress. She recoiled, hissing in a language that made my ears bleed and my eyes burn. Cortez fled. By the time church elders investigated, she had vanished. A letter, her handwriting but not her words, explained a sudden return to Spain. No ship's manifest ever recorded her departure. The most disturbing evidence came from James Wilson, a surveyor who discovered the impossible. Ferrel House was larger inside than out. The interior dimensions exceeded the exterior by 30 feet on each side. Some spaces aren't meant to be measured, Timoteo told him with a terrible smile. Some spaces exist between the counts. Elizabeth Ferrel died in December 1845, but not before whispering a final warning to Reverend Clark. They need 29. Always 29. But on the last night, the counting room takes one more. It takes one of us. At her funeral, as the first earth hit her coffin, a woman's voice from the distant house counted slowly to 29. Timoteo and Evangeline's lips moved in perfect unison with the sound, their eyes fixed on something no one else could see. The disappearances continued, but the pattern changed. No longer tied to the lunar cycle, they now coincided with each expansion of the Ferrel fortune. As if whatever pretense had existed was no longer necessary. The counting room was preparing to reveal itself, and the horror that had only been glimpsed would soon emerge fully into the world. The winter of 1847 brought record cold to Ashbridge County. The Mississippi froze solid enough to walk across. Livestock died in their barns despite roaring fires. People spoke of a curse upon the land. Ferrel House, no one noticed the cold. Flowers bloomed in the gardens despite frost thick enough to crack stone. The fountains flowed with water that steamed but never froze. And at night, lights moved behind windows in the west wing. Windows that, when viewed from certain angles, seemed to open onto spaces that couldn't possibly exist within the mansion's walls. Samuel Reed, the new blacksmith who had taken over after his predecessor vanished, described what he saw while riding past the estate late one January evening. The windows were like eyes, watching, blinking. In one, I swear I saw a room the size of a cathedral, though such a space couldn't fit inside that house unless it somehow reached into the earth or elsewhere. In another, something moved in circles, counting aloud in a voice that made my horse rear and nearly throw me. When I steadied her and looked again, the windows showed only darkness. But the counting continued. The physical impossibilities of Ferrel House multiplied. Visitors reported doorways that led to different rooms depending on the time of day. Stairways that descended for longer than the house was tall. Corridors that circled back on themselves despite maintaining a straight line. Dr. Morris, still the family physician, confided to his journal, "I've attended the Ferrels for over 20 years, yet I've never seen the same room twice. Today, I swear the corridor outside Timoteo's study stretched for 100 yards, though the house itself is no more than 80 feet across." When I mentioned this, he smiled, that terrible smile that never reaches his eyes, and said, "The counting room makes space for what it needs." Morris's journal entries grew increasingly disturbed until February 1847, when they abruptly ceased. His body was found 3 days later in the woods behind his home, frozen despite being surrounded by a perfect circle of thawed earth. Clutched in his hand was a black rose that, according to those who discovered him, seemed to writhe like something alive when they tried to remove it from his rigid fingers. The most terrifying incidents centered around the unnatural phenomena that seemed to radiate outward from the estate. Clocks stopped within a mile radius of Ferrel House, or worse, ran backward for precisely 29 minutes before resuming their normal function. Animals refused to approach the property line. Birds fell dead from the sky when flying overhead. Jonathan Parker, who owned the neighboring farm, reported that his field adjacent to Ferrel land had turned barren overnight, not just failing to produce crops, but transforming into soil so black and fine it resembled ash. At the exact boundary between his property and the Ferrels, a line of black roses had sprouted, their blooms facing his house like watching eyes. "They grew in a single night," Parker testified to the town council. "Perfectly straight, perfectly spaced. 29 of them. I tried to cut them down, but my blade passed through them as if they weren't there. When I reached out to touch one, my fingers came away wet with something that looked like blood but smelled like grave dirt." Within a week, Parker's livestock sickened and died. Within 2, his wife began waking screaming from nightmares she couldn't, or wouldn't, describe. By the 3rd week, Their 10-year-old son was sleepwalking toward the Ferrel property each night, mumbling numbers in sequence. The Parkers abandoned their farm on the 28th day. On the 29th, their house burned to the ground in a fire that consumed only their property, stopping precisely at the line marked by the black roses. By spring, Timoteo Ferrel had purchased the Parker land for a fraction of its worth. The roses vanished. The soil returned to normal. Crops planted by Ferrel workers thrived as if the land had never known blight. The incidents multiplied. Father Thomas Rodriguez, sent by the diocese to investigate reports of demonic activity at Ferrel House, approached the property with crucifix raised and holy water at the ready. Witnesses from town, watching from a safe distance, reported that the priest made it halfway up the drive before freezing in place. "He just stopped," said Elijah Tompkins, the baker who had accompanied Rodriguez to the edge of the property. Mid-step, like a clock winding down. Then his mouth opened, but the voice that came out wasn't his. It was like a chorus of voices, all counting in unison. When they reached 29, Father Rodriguez turned around and walked back to us. But it wasn't him anymore. The priest returned to the church, packed his belongings, and left town that night. The letter received by the bishop a week later, supposedly from Rodriguez, claimed he had lost his faith and abandoned his calling. When church authorities finally located him in a New Orleans asylum months later, he was found in a small room, the walls covered in tally marks grouped in sets of 29, his fingers raw from counting. Even nature itself seemed to bend around Ferrel House. Visitors reported time moving strangely on the grounds, sometimes too quickly, with the sun setting minutes after it had risen. Sometimes too slowly, with a single drop of dew taking an hour to fall from a leaf. The moon, when viewed from the property, appeared larger and tinged with red, as if seen through a veil of blood. Most disturbing were the roses, black as pitch, impossibly formed, appearing where no flowers had been planted. They bloomed in perfect circles around the estate, 29 to a circle. They grew from the cracks between floorboards inside the house. They sprouted from the grave of Elizabeth Ferrel, whose burial site was said to sink an inch deeper into the earth with each new moon. "The roses are its eyes," claimed Agnes Reynolds, who had fled Ferrel House after discovering a bloom growing from the center of her pillow one morning. "Whatever lives in the counting room, whatever made that bargain with Timoteo, it watches through them. It listens. It waits." By 1848, Evangeline Ferrel had changed in ways that defied natural explanation. Though now in her 30s, she appeared no older than 20. Her skin had taken on a luminous quality that townsfolk described as beautiful in a way that makes your eyes hurt to look at. Her voice, once soft, now seemed to echo as if speaking from inside a vast chamber. Most alarming were the occasions when she was seen in two places simultaneously, a phenomenon attested to by multiple witnesses. Mary Simmons, who taught at the small schoolhouse in town, described looking up from her lesson to see Evangeline standing outside the window, staring at the children with hungry eyes. That same morning, the bank manager recorded meeting with Evangeline to discuss business matters 3 miles away. "She's becoming like the house," Reverend Clark wrote in a letter to his bishop, "existing in spaces that shouldn't be possible. I fear that whatever bargain Timoteo Ferrel made all those years ago, the price is higher than even he understood. I fear his daughter is becoming part of that price." Timoteo himself had aged, but not in any natural way. His hair remained mostly black, with streaks of silver at the temples. His face showed few wrinkles, but his eyes had sunk deeper into his skull, and his fingers had elongated until they resembled talons more than human digits. Those who did business with him reported that he now counted constantly, tapping fingers against his thigh, mouthing numbers silently, his eyes darting as if tracking invisible tallies in the air. During meetings, he would sometimes stop mid-sentence, cocking his head as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. "He's afraid," said William Hayes, a cotton buyer who had dealt with the Ferrels for decades. "For all his power, all his wealth, Timoteo Ferrel is terrified of something. I saw it in his eyes last month when I delivered payment for the spring harvest." He looked at the calendar on his desk, and for just a moment, his mask slipped. What I saw beneath it wasn't human anymore. The calendar Hayes referred to had been marked with a date, October 31st, 1849. Beside it, in handwriting that matched no known script, was drawn a single symbol that Hayes could not identify but which made him sick to look upon, as if my mind itself rejected what my eyes were seeing. As 1849 approached, the phenomena around Ferrel House intensified. The boundaries between the natural and unnatural world grew thinner. People reported seeing figures moving through solid walls of the mansion. Shadows detached from their owners and walked independently through the gardens. The sound of counting, sometimes whispered, sometimes screamed, echoed across the town on still nights. In April 1849, a group of local men, fortified with whiskey and armed with torches, attempted to burn Ferrel House to the ground. Led by Jonathan Parker, who had lost everything to the family's unnatural influence, they approached the mansion after midnight, certain that Timoteo and Evangeline were away on business in New Orleans. None returned. Searching parties found only their abandoned torches at the edge of the property, arranged in a perfect circle. 29 torches, though only 12 men had set out that night. From each torch grew a single black rose, its petals wet with what looked like fresh blood. By summer, a pall had fallen over Ashbridge. Crops withered in the fields despite abundant rain. Children were kept indoors after dark. Church attendance swelled as people sought protection from what many now openly called the Ferrel curse. Most terrifying was the discovery made by a young boy who had dared his friends to touch the wrought iron fence surrounding the Ferrel property. When his hand made contact with the metal, he screamed, not from pain, but from what he saw. "The house isn't a house," he babbled after being pulled away. "It's skin. It's just the skin on top. Underneath, it's all counting. Rooms full of counting. And they're almost done." The boy developed a high fever that night and began counting obsessively, refusing to stop even to eat or sleep. On the 29th hour of his counting, his heart simply stopped. The doctor who examined him found a perfect black handprint over his chest, though no one had touched him there. As October approached, Timoteo and Evangeline withdrew completely from public view. Lights burned in Ferrel House at all hours, yet no one was seen entering or leaving. Strange sounds echoed from the property. Not just counting now, but chanting in a language that made listeners' ears bleed. The black roses spread, forming concentric circles that expanded outward from the mansion like ripples in a pond. On October 30th, 1849, the day before the date marked on Timoteo's calendar, Reverend Clark gathered the townspeople in the church to pray for deliverance from whatever was coming. As night fell, the candles on the altar extinguished themselves one by one. In the darkness, the congregation heard a single voice, neither male nor female, neither young nor old, count slowly from 1 to 29. When the final number was spoken, the church doors burst open. Framed in the doorway stood Evangeline Ferrel, her body impossibly elongated, her skin glowing with an inner light that cast no shadows. Behind her, visible through the open doors, Ferrel House pulsed like a living heart against the night sky. "The counting room has waited 30 years," she announced in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Tomorrow it claims its due, the 29th soul and the 30th sacrifice. The bargain will be renewed." She turned and walked away, her footsteps leaving small black roses that withered and died as quickly as they bloomed. That night, no one in Ashbridge slept. They watched from locked homes as Ferrel House twisted and changed, its architecture reshaping itself like clay in unseen hands. Windows appeared and disappeared. Walls breathed in and out. The very ground beneath the mansion seemed to ripple. And all through the night, the counting continued, soft at first, then louder, then so deafening it shook the windows of homes a mile away. 1 to 29, over and over, a terrible rhythm building toward something no one dared imagine. What happened on October 31st, 1849, what emerged from the counting room when its tally was finally complete, would forever change Ashbridge and the dark legacy of the Ferrel family. But that horror, the culmination of decades of unnatural accumulation and sacrifice, belongs to our final chapter. October 31st, 1849, dawned blood-red over Ashbridge. The sun rose not yellow but crimson, casting the town in a light that made everything look as if it were underwater. Distorted, drowning. Birds lay dead in the streets. Livestock cowered in their pens. Even the insects had gone silent. At Ferrel house, the counting had stopped. After a night of building sound that had driven some townsfolk to pierce their own eardrums for relief, the sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. The mansion stood perfectly still against the red sky, every window dark. The black roses surrounding it turned to face the building like worshippers awaiting revelation. "It's ready," whispered Reverend Clark to the handful of men who had gathered in the church bell tower with rifles and Bibles. "Whatever they've been feeding for all these years, it's finished counting." No one entered Ferrel house that day. No one left. As noon approached, a strange darkness began to gather around the mansion despite the cloudless sky. Shadows that should have pointed west at midday instead curved toward the house like iron filings drawn to a magnet. At precisely 12 o'clock, every clock in Ashbridge struck 13 times, then stopped forever. What happened next was witnessed by 29 people, no more, no less, who had positioned themselves at various points around town with views of the Ferrel estate. Their testimonies, collected later by investigators from the state capitol, aligned with such perfect precision that no authority could dismiss them, though many tried. The ground beneath Ferrel house opened, not in an earthquake or sinkhole, but in a deliberate parting, like lips forming a smile. The mansion didn't collapse into the void. Instead, it distended, stretching downward as if made of taffy, windows elongating into screaming mouths, doors twisting into impossible shapes. From these openings poured darkness, not absence of light, but darkness as a tangible substance, flowing like oil across the grounds. Within this darkness moved shapes that the witnesses could describe only by their effects. Where they passed, matter aged or decayed or transformed. A tree touched by one such shape aged 100 years in seconds, its bark peeling away, its heartwood turning to dust. A bird flying overhead burst into flame, then frost, then shattered like glass. At the center of this maelstrom stood two figures on the front steps of the distorting mansion: Timoteo and Evangeline Ferrel. Even from a distance, witnesses could see that something had changed in both of them. Timoteo's body seemed to be collapsing in on itself, his once tall frame now bent and twisted as if under enormous pressure. His mouth moved constantly, counting numbers that no longer made sound. Evangeline, by contrast, had grown, not in size but in presence. The air around her shimmered like heat over desert sand. Her dress, witnesses agreed, was not cloth but living shadow, moving independently of her body. Where her eyes should have been were empty sockets that somehow still watched, still saw. "The father was being consumed," reported Jonathan Miller, viewing through a spyglass from the church roof. "The daughter was becoming." As the witnesses watched in helpless terror, a third figure emerged from the mansion. A woman in white, her face obscured, moving with the jerky gait of a marionette. Though none could see her features clearly, all 29 witnesses identified her immediately. Elizabeth Ferrel, dead for 4 years yet walking. The corpse puppet of Elizabeth moved to stand beside her husband and daughter. Together, the three Ferrels formed a triangle on the steps. Inside this triangle, the darkness pooled and deepened until it seemed to open onto a space beyond the world. A void in which something waited. From this void emerged a hand. No witness could agree on its appearance. Some described it as skeletal, others as composed of pure shadow, still others as made of thousands of crawling insects. All agreed on its size, large enough to engulf a human body, and its purpose made clear as it reached for Timoteo Ferrel. "It's come to collect." Timoteo's voice carried unnaturally across the distance to the witnesses, though his lips never moved. 30 years to the day. The bargain must be honored. The hand closed around him. What happened next violated every natural law. Timoteo Ferrel's body compressed, twisted, folded in ways human flesh should not bend. His scream started human but rose in pitch until it passed beyond hearing, though dogs across the county howled in response. The hand squeezed, and Timoteo, the man who had built an empire on blood and counting, was reduced to a singularity, a pinpoint of dense matter that glowed with the light of concentrated suffering. This light hovered for a moment above the palm of the impossible hand. Then, with deliberate precision, it was placed in Evangeline's outstretched palm. "The sacrifice is accepted," said Evangeline, her voice now a chorus of 29 distinct tones speaking in unison. "The covenant is renewed." The corpse of Elizabeth Ferrel crumbled to dust that swirled upward to join the churning darkness. The hand withdrew into the void, which sealed itself like a healing wound. The darkness that had spilled across the grounds flowed back toward the mansion, carrying with it dead things restored to unnatural life. Birds with burning eyes, insects that spelled words as they flew, flowers that screamed with human voices. As suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Ferrel House settled back into its foundations, though its architecture had changed subtly, windows and doors no longer where they had been. The entire structure twisted clockwise a few crucial degrees. Standing alone on the steps was Evangeline Ferrel, clutching a small, glowing object to her chest. She looked out at the distant witnesses and smiled. A smile that 29 people would later describe as the end of hope. Then she turned and entered the mansion, closing the door behind her. For 3 days, no one dared approach Ferrel House. On the 4th day, Reverend Clark led a delegation of town officials to investigate, certain that whatever evil had manifested had either departed or consumed itself. They found the mansion silent but unlocked. Inside, everything appeared normal, opulent, well-maintained, utterly conventional. No distorted architecture, no counting room, no black roses, just a wealthy home like any other. In the study, they found Evangeline Ferrel reviewing business ledgers as if nothing had happened. When questioned about the events witnessed 4 days earlier, she expressed polite confusion. "My father has gone abroad on business," she told them with a smile that never reached her eyes. "I'm managing our affairs until his return, though I fear his trip may be extended." When Reverend Clark demanded to know what had happened to Timoteo, Evangeline opened her hand to reveal a pocket watch of unusual design. Its face bore no numbers, only a complex symbol at its center. Its single hand moved counterclockwise. "Time works differently for Father now," she said. "He's counting from the other direction." The delegation left empty-handed. There was nothing to find, nothing to prove. Just the testimony of 29 witnesses whose stories were too consistent to be madness, too impossible to be true. In the months that followed, life in Ashbridge attempted to return to normal. Evangeline Ferrel continued her father's business empire with frightening efficiency. The phenomena around the estate ceased. The black roses vanished. Clocks resumed their proper function. But changes lingered. The 29 witnesses found themselves counting obsessively, unable to stop. Some reported seeing Timoteo Ferrel's face in reflective surfaces, his mouth moving in a silent count. Others claimed to hear Elizabeth's voice on the wind, warning that the next cycle has begun. Most disturbing were the dreams, shared by all 29 witnesses, of a vast, circular room beneath Ferrel House, its walls lined with niches containing pocket watches identical to the one Evangeline had shown them. In these dreams, each watch contained not machinery but a human soul, compressed and folded and made to count eternally backward from 29. In one niche, larger than the others, waited an empty space. By 1850, Evangeline had expanded the Ferrel holdings beyond anything her father had achieved. Cotton plantations across 3 states, banking interests that reached to Europe, shipping companies that dominated the Mississippi, political influence that made governors and senators speak her name in whispers. Yet she remained unmarried, alone in the vast mansion that sometimes seemed to shift its dimensions when no one was looking directly at it. Those who did business with her reported that she never aged, never tired, and never stopped wearing the peculiar pocket watch that had once been her father. The pattern of disappearances resumed, but changed. No longer tied to lunar cycles or countdowns, they now occurred seemingly at random, yet always in service to the Ferrel fortune. A business rival who stood in Evangeline's way would vanish overnight. A politician who opposed her interests would disappear, only to be replaced by someone more amenable to her wishes. And always, with each disappearance, Another pocket watch would appear in Evangeline's collection, displayed in a special cabinet in her study, each one beating with a rhythm just out of sync with human hearts. The years passed. Decades. Evangeline Ferrel never aged a day. By 1879, 30 years after the transformation of Timoteo, the phenomena began again. Clocks running backward. Black roses blooming where none had been planted. The sound of counting echoing across town on still nights. The people of Ashbridge, many of whom had not been born when the last cycle ended, did not understand the signs. But the descendants of the 29 witnesses remembered the stories. They fled town as October approached. On October 31, 1879, exactly 30 years after Timoteo had been taken, Ferrel House twisted itself open once more. The hand emerged again. This time it was Evangeline who stepped forward to be taken. Not in fear, but in triumph. "The contract renews," she declared to the empty air. "The count continues." The hand closed around her. When it withdrew, she remained, unchanged in appearance but somehow more than she had been, less human, more other. In her hands, she held not one pocket watch but two, her father's and her own. That night, 29 people across Ashbridge dreamed of a circular room with 30 niches, 28 of them filled with watches, 2 larger spaces occupied, and one, the largest, still waiting. The cycle repeated in 1909, and again in 1939. Each time, Evangeline Ferrel appeared to sacrifice herself to the hand from beyond. Yet each time she returned stronger, her fortune greater, her humanity more distant. By 1969, no one in Ashbridge spoke the Ferrel name aloud. The mansion stood empty most of the year, Evangeline's business empire now run from offices in New York and London. Yet on October 31st, lights always burned in Ferrel House. The counting always resumed. In 1999, exactly 150 years after the first recorded manifestation, something changed. When the hand emerged from the void beneath the twisting mansion, Evangeline Ferrel did not step forward alone. With her came 29 figures, men and women of different ages and eras, their faces blank, their movements synchronized. The descendants of those who had witnessed the original covenant, drawn back to Ashbridge by dreams they couldn't explain, by an obsession with counting they couldn't control. As the hand reached for Evangeline, she raised both arms like a conductor before an orchestra. The 29 watchers did the same. In perfect unison, they began to count backward from 29, their voices merging into a single sound that bent reality around them. The final count approaches. Evangeline's voice rose above the chorus. The circle nears completion. One space remains. The hand hesitated, then withdrew without taking her. The void closed. Ferrel House settled back into its foundations, though now it seemed to exist in multiple configurations simultaneously, its architecture a quantum uncertainty rather than a fixed structure. The 29 watchers dispersed, returning to lives they barely remembered, carrying within them a piece of whatever had been awakened beneath Ferrel House. And Evangeline Ferrel, or what she had become, waited. The last confirmed sighting of her was in early 2000. A real estate developer who had purchased the supposedly abandoned Ferrel House reported meeting an ageless woman in the entrance hall who informed him that his purchase was premature. The developer's body was found 3 days later in the woods behind the mansion, a pocket watch clutched in his rigid fingers, his face frozen in an expression that the coroner described as beyond terror, beyond anything human. Ferrel House still stands today, though few can agree on its appearance or exact location. Maps of Ashbridge show contradictory placements. Photographs capture different architectural styles. Some visitors report seeing a crumbling ruin, others a pristine mansion, still others an empty lot with a single black rose growing at its center. Local legend holds that the final counting will occur in 2029, 30 years after the last recorded manifestation, 180 years after Timoteo Ferrel was taken by whatever entity he had bargained with. Those sensitive to such things avoid Ashbridge entirely now. Those who must pass through report hearing counting on the wind, no longer a countdown but a count-up. 1, 2, 3, moving inexorably toward 29. And beyond that, to the 30th count, The one that will fill the last and largest niche in the circular room beneath the mansion that isn't a mansion. The room where the watches tick. The room where the bargain was made. The room where something waits that has almost finished counting. The counting room. If you find yourself near Ashbridge, and you hear counting on the wind, drive on. Do not stop. Do not look back. And whatever you do, do not count along. Because the Ferrel legacy continues. The wealth remains. The contract stands eternal. And the counting room always collects what it is owed. What drives humans to make bargains they cannot possibly understand? Is any fortune worth the price of one's humanity, or the souls of those we claim to love? The Ferrel legacy serves as a chilling metaphor for unchecked ambition. From Timoteo's humble beginnings to the empire built on disappeared servants and orphan children, we see how easily morality can be sacrificed on the altar of prosperity. Each generation paid in blood what could never be settled in gold. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this tale isn't the supernatural entity that waited in the counting room, but how recognizable the pattern remains today. How many modern fortunes stand upon invisible suffering? How many empires are built on bargains whose true costs remain hidden? The counting room exists in many forms, sometimes as literal as the ledger in Evangeline's study, sometimes as metaphorical as the systems that allow wealth to accumulate at the expense of the vulnerable. The hand that reaches from the void wears many guises, but it always collects its due. As you consider this tale, ask yourself, what bargains have you made in your own life? What prices are you willing to pay, or make others pay, for success? If this exploration of darkness and ambition resonated with you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these forgotten histories and the warnings they contain. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next journey into the shadows of American folklore. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Would you have taken Timoteo's bargain if you knew the price? What other cursed legacies should we investigate next? Your engagement helps our community grow and guides our future explorations. Remember, wealth obtained through darkness casts the longest shadows. The counting room always collects what it is owed. And sometimes the greatest horror lies not in the supernatural, but in what humans are willing to do for power and prosperity. Until next time, keep watching the shadows, and be careful what you count on.